As a kid, I was raised in a small fishing community on the eastern side of Canada, surrounded by the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the Boreal Forest. The entirety of the land was close to 4,000 foot square, with even smaller number of residents sprawled out over Main Street, the main road running straight through our little town, and farming houses spread widely between areas of trees that were changed to domestic residential homes when agriculture stopped being profitable. In total, our community is surrounded by a vast expanse of ocean and a seemingly endless barrage of trees that spread over 55% of Canada's entire country. I spent most of my life hunting in those woods, so you can imagine my joy when my parents got me a hunting dog. Sandy was a Shetland sheepdog. And while they were more fit to be herding and trafficking sheep over grassy plains rather than rabbits and deer through dense forest, it didn't stop me from taking him with me on every excursion I possibly could. Sandy had been by my side for enough hunting trips that he'd grown accustomed to waking up just before breaking daylight, and on a few occasions, he even helped track down small game like squirrels and rabbits through considerably large areas of forest. Sandy wasn't my property to me, and wasn't treated like he belonged to me. Sandy was a member of the family, my best companion, and my truest friend. I think fondly back on all the times he'd sit in the front seat of the truck without being told, and always ready to go for a walk in whatever part of the forest I took him to. I can honestly say that there will never be a dog that will fill the void Sandy left in my life. I find that dog lovers relate to that sentiment more than others. It was October 30th, the first day of deer hunting season. I had been talking with my family about Sandy and taking him with me, my hunting gear, and some essentials to one of the cabins my grandfather owned in his heyday off an unmarked road a few hundred miles into the wilderness for a few days. This was met with a lot of protesting, but nothing could stop me from getting in some time looking for wild game in an area that wasn't already picked clean by illegal hunters early on in the month. Everything was packed into the old blue Ford, Sandy included, and a few hours of driving later, we were setting up camp in one of my grandfather's secluded old cabins. Here's where things got fucked up. Sandy, I'm so sorry. I had spent most of the time of my life being in the wilderness. There were only a handful of times that things had gotten weird for me, but usually everything can be explained with scientific reason. That's why I brushed off Sandy's weird behavior in the first few nights, chalking it up to the nervousness of a dog that's capable of hearing the far-off noises of coyotes, wolves, bears, and moose. This was untouched territory, of course. There had been plenty of time for wildlife to set up camp here too. The first night was fairly normal. I had set up Sandy's bed in the corner of my living room, next to the TV that looked like it came out of the early 90s. I figured I'd give Sandy the option to have someplace to lay down for a while, despite the fact that he slept curled up with me 9 times out of 10. Close to 10 at night, Sandy looked straight at the wooden door and whined. I figured he needed to piss and opened the door to let him out, not worried about having my best friend stray too far away from me. But instead, he just sat inside, looking out at the forest's edge beyond the path. I too stood and looked for a few minutes before deciding he had just heard an errant critter close to the cabin. The rest of the night was fairly normal, and Sandy and me slept fine. The second night, I chalked the weirdness up to Sandy's stress. Earlier in the day, we had been walking a few miles through the woods beyond the house, and I thought I heard the sound of twigs cracking under something heavy. I hoped it wasn't a moose, because my shotgun wouldn't have stood a chance. But something changed in Sandy that I didn't pay close attention to at the time. He hunched himself on his hind legs, his front pressed close to the ground, his mouth pulled up over his teeth, and he growled towards nothing. I figured we'd try hunting again later, if whatever it was had left and should be feeling up to it. But once we were inside, he didn't want to move. Even when I tried to get him to go outside and do his business, he sat at the door and whined, blowing at me to let me know that he didn't want to go out there. I didn't force him. If you pissed on the floor, who cares? Sandy never acted like this before. I could excuse an accident or two if he really didn't want to be out there. It must have been a bear, I thought, before locking the door and calling it a night. The third night is where things went to hell, and I still to this day don't fully understand what happened. Sandy didn't eat a single thing that day. I managed to shoot a rabbit earlier in the morning, when Sandy decided he didn't want to be outside any longer than he had to, and he retired inside for the day. I cooked it up, threw a little gravy on it, and gave it to him. I didn't do this all the time, but I figured now was a special occasion, and maybe a treat would put him in the better mood for another walk the next day. Sandy didn't even touch it. He didn't sniff it, look at it, or even acknowledge it. Instead, he sat at my side on the couch, watching the door intently. I tucked him under my arm, and he laid his head on my lap. I still locked the door. Close to 3 hours of watching grainy VHS tapes on an outdated television set, Sandy started whining, hugging himself close to my body. This is where my judgment took me down the wrong path, for the first of many. It must sound silly, being my dog's protector rather than my dog being mine. But this was my family. I figured that if there was something out there that was scaring Sandy so bad, then it was my job to do something about it. I loaded my gun, opened the door, stood in the doorway and waited. I must have waited at least 5 minutes staring into nothing. There was barely any sound, save for the faint buzz of insects and leaves rustling in the cold autumn wind. Moose are not elegant creatures, and if it were a moose, I would have heard it coming. After around 15 minutes, Sandy took off like a shot into the darkness of the trees beyond the path, barking savagely. I was horrified. Despite my knowledge that my dog is entirely helpless in the wilderness, there were still bigger animals that would have taken a bite out of him if it weren't for a lot of food in the winter. I heard Sandy's barking fade away in the distance, and then stop altogether. I waited hours, standing in the doorway with my shotgun cocked, and ready to put down whatever it was that was waiting in the woods. I waited for hours for Sandy to come back to the house. I waited until the sun was cracking through the trees, and then I waited until that night, sitting on my porch step, feigning off sleep deprivation to see my dog come back. Sandy did come back, but not for another 3 days. Fog had rolled in at that point, and it was getting darker, the night painting the sky a navy blue. Trekking over the last few days proved futile, and I started to get worried that I need to leave and find more provisions to last me the next few nights. I couldn't leave Sandy alone, lost in the woods, cold and hungry. The thought that he might be waiting out there for me to find him and bring him back home was distressing enough. I was packing the bag that hung on the coat rack next to the door with what I'd need for the next day's trip. I figured tomorrow would be the last day before I'd go into town and see if my father would help me find Sandy. He was a retired old man, but I was sure if I brought up Sandy's name, he'd be more than willing to help me search for him. Thankfully, Sandy came back while I was in the midst of that train of thought. I saw him from the window on the path that led down to the main road, a few dozen feet away from the house. Normally I'd hear him scamper to the doorway and paw at the door a few times, eager to come in. But that didn't happen. I could see the reflection of his eyes as green pearls in the murky fog that had swamped the house. For a moment, I thought it might have been an animal. But the outline of his body in the wisps of thick, low-lying clouds was unmistakable. Still, despite myself, I hesitated. There was something different about his body language. I stared out the window for a few more moments before reason overcame my gut instinct. Sandy could be hurt, I thought. Or worse. I flung the doorway open, but he didn't come right away. Instead, he stood there, watching me intently. And when he didn't move, I whistled to him. "Here, Sandy." I led him towards the house. "Here, boy." The way he moved was strange. It was as though his hips had been dislocated, and the angle of his paws changed direction with every step he took, as though he'd forgotten how to walk properly. His head was bowed to the ground, but his teeth weren't bared. He didn't seem aggressive. The only way I could describe the way he looked was sheepish. Like he'd just gotten into trouble and I yelled at him for it. I was worried he might hurt himself hopping up onto the elevated step if he had dislocated his hips. But he did just fine. His back half swung a little, oddly enough, and his paws almost folded underneath himself. But he didn't grow sprawling. He sat on the step, and he didn't look away from me. It wasn't until I had moved the doorway completely, opened the door wide and waited for him to walk in, that he finally moved. Straight to his bed. He didn't stop at my hand or sniff me. He didn't wait for pets or jump up on me like he normally did. It was straight to his bed, where he sat and watched me for quite some time afterwards. I returned to watching the movie. I called for him a few times, but he didn't respond. His ears didn't so much raise to the sound of my voice, or the pat of my hand onto the worn-out couch beside me. I wanted to know what was wrong with him, but I wasn't about to move him physically towards me. There was something about him that said I shouldn't have let him in, but I chalked it all up to silliness. And a few hours later, I went to bed. The more I think back on it, I don't remember him blinking once. He just sat there like a statue. And when I turned off the light, I could still see the reflection of his jade green eyes following me as I went into my room and then shut the door.